Hello, everyone. Welcome to the event. My name is Jairaj Sundareshan. I teach at the Department of Geography and Environment in LSE. I also volunteer with the LSE Decolonizing LSE Collective. Decolonizing LSE Collective is a collective of staff and students that work in LSE connected to related questions. You can find us in, we have a website, we have a Twitter account, Instagram, Facebook, so you can find us in all of this, and please check there for our events, activities, campaigns, and also archives. It is also an archive of a large number of events connected to disciplines, practices, and so on that we have organized, and also links to many other resources too. So today we have Dr. Ragupathy Venkatachalam with us to talk to us about alternate possibilities of thinking about economics. The title of the talk is again Standardization, Reflections on Logic and Economics. Dr. Ragupathy Venkatachalam is a lecturer in economics at the Institute of Management Studies in Goldsmiths, University of London. His broad research areas include endogenous business cycle theory, computable economics, behavioral economics, agent-based computational economics, and history of economic thought. His research focuses on the algorithmic modes of theorizing, both at the micro and macro level, incorporating insights from computability theory and constructive mathematics. He is the associate editor of Economia Politica, that is a journal of analytical and institutional economics, and we are very lucky to have Raghu to give us insights into one of the foundational questions and one of the foundational ways to think about, rethink about economics. Raghu will speak for about 45 minutes or so, or maybe a little bit more. We are flexible with that. We have about an hour and a half, and there'll be a lot of space for discussions after that. The last point is the event is being recorded, particularly the talk will be recorded and it will be uploaded on our website and YouTube channels and so on. The Q&A will not be recorded so that there'll be enough space for free conversations and all that. So on that note, welcome Dr. Raghu, and over to you.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a logician, and I'm not a post-colonial scholar, so it puts me in a comfortable position to reflect on these things from the margins. So yeah, thanks again for inviting me. So I'll share my screen. Can you see? Is that okay? So so today I was going to talk about different aspects of economics and history of economic thought. Then I decided to go for something a bit more different, which is against standardization and on what this means for the decolonial movement and so on. So to begin, I want to start with a favorite play of mine, which I recently watched before all the lockdown all came, by Brian Friel, and it has a connection to the story, and I'll come to it shortly. So the play is called Translations, and it is set in 1820s Ireland. So it starts with
is this the beginning?
Sorry. It starts with a rural Donegal in Ireland, and the British Army or English Army has gone there to do a survey, the Ordnance Survey, and it happens to sort of go about standardizing Gaelic language, which is being spoken there, Irish, and the whole part of the colonial sort of activity was to standardize the language, the place names, and also to systematically wipe out the identity, the Gaelic identity of the Irish people there. And a key part of the colonization process is about this tension that comes with standardization that is being, masterfully performed recently, but also the play is a very nice one. Now, the reason why I start with this is because one of the key messages that I want to touch upon is, what is one common element in the process of colonization across different episodes? It's there is of course the power politics, there is subjugation, and so on. But what I'm interested is in the process of colonization. What is that a common thread that we can tease out? And to this effect, I think one of the things that we should focus on probably is about standardization of language, of practices, of institutions. So this you see in the English colonial episodes in Ireland, to a certain extent in India, but most certainly in those of Spanish in Latin America and French in Africa, where you see very pronounced standardization of education, language, institutions, revenue collection. So it wouldn't be too far a stretch to say that standardization is amongst, is a highly correlated feature in different colonial episodes. So you also see beginnings of standardization in a very strong way in the 16th and 17th century. You have the first dictionaries, which you transition from glossaries to dictionaries in Italy, and also here in Europe, and also you have the Industrial Revolution, which adds fuel to a lot of standardization. So, and what now? Okay, yes, there is standardization, and what does this have to do with economics? Now, I want to sort of, move a little bit to the side and also think about some of the origins of modern economics. A lot of people start with the landmark publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but I think it dates back further. Adam Smith, is famous for not attributing his sources, and he got away with a lot, but that's a separate story. We go to the pre-classical origins of economics. And one of the key players there is William Petty. William Petty is a famous physician. He was also, interacting with people like Descartes, Hobbes, and he was a big ardent follower of Bacon's philosophy. And economists would know him for writing the famous text on political arithmetic, and also a treatise on taxes and contributions. Now, what is the relevance of Petty in the story? Petty wrote all of this stuff. He transitioned from being a physician to a surveyor during his trip to Ireland. So it's a little bit of history here. During the 1600s, you had the Cromwellian army, which was led by Oliver Cromwell, where the English were trying to put down the rebellion in Ireland, and they were raising money from the parliament with the promise of being paid back in land. So Petty was going there to do the survey known as the Down Survey. So what happens here is that in order to distribute the land for all those people who have lent money to the parliament, you need to understand the value of land. So you need to understand how to sort of first measure, and then how to sort of systematically divide this. So he faces a problem of actually finding a par value. That is, how do you express land, or how do you find a total surplus that is available, and how do you divide that? Now, this begins a whole tradition of social surplus and value theory. In fact, the idea of par value between land and labor theory of value, in fact, stems from William Petty. But what people don't understand is he was an unabashed or unashamed colonial sympathizer. And so from the very origins of the subject, there is a sort of a link between the background in which classical economics comes about has very strong colonial origins. Now, that does not mean that the ideas themselves should be sort of abandoned, but it is good to keep this in mind, that this standardization, finding standard values, standard metrics in order to express value, and also in terms of how to raise taxes and so on, institutions, homogenization of institutions, is starting with betting. So standardization meets modern economics via many routes. First is the standardization of theories, which we often see that there's a strong convergence to neoclassical modes of theorizing in the post-war period, and especially in microeconomics, that you can see. For instance, if you go to almost any undergraduate level teaching, the kind of textbooks they use are highly, homogeneous in some sense. But there is also a high degree of standardization of mathematical methods and statistical methods for economics that are being used. Yes, of course, there is a slight variety, but the case that I will be making is that these methods are still based on very specific kinds of mathematics and logic within the world of mathematics. And the third kind of standardization that comes through is through textbooks, which starts prominently, in my opinion, with Sam Wilson's Foundations of Economics, but also you have Varian, Maskelyl, Mankiw, Sargent, Lucas Stokey. All of these have become standard textbooks. So you teach generations of students, train them in certain methods, and without uncritically engaging in making them aware that there are alternative ways of doing things. So you see also this in the mathematization of economics that happens in the post-war period. Mathematical economics starts in some sense with von Thunen, Cournot, but then the major impetus is given by von Neumann, Leontief, Koopmans, Frisch, Havel, Mombon on the statistical side, but also Paul Samuelson, his famous work on maximum principles. And there's Solow, Arrow's proof of existence of the general equilibrium, Debreu again, Lucas and Prescott and so on the recursive methods and dynamic programming within macroeconomics. So what happens is this drive for mathematical ways of expressing theories in economics has managed to drive out other forms of reasoning and argumentation. If you see today, less than 2 or 3% of the papers in the top 10 journals that are published which do not have an explicit mathematical argument. So what I'm trying to say is, without judgment, that there is factual homogenization of the way in which we argue mathematical theories. Now, there is also this perception that because it is mathematical, it is more, in some sense, a higher truth kind of a perception, at least among students. So some of the questions that we have to ask here are, what kind of mathematics underpins formal economic theories of today? The answer is that it is predominantly real analysis and set theory, with or without axiom of choice. This is what is known as the Zermelo-Frankel system. And all of this is in turn built on classical mathematical logic. By classical mathematical logic, I refer to the ones started by Frege, Boole, Venn, and so on and so forth. So anyone who is familiar with starting with mathematics often starts with set theory and real analysis, which are sort of backbones. And after that, you have all sorts of things that are built on that. For instance, convex analysis, differential equations, all of these regular tools that we use are highly concentrated in particular specific areas of classical mathematics. However, this is only one kind of mathematics or logic. Even within the world of logic, at least you can think of 4 different foundations. Set theory is only one of them. There is proof theory, there is model theory, there is recursion theory. There is at least, among the 4 pillars of mathematical logic, set theory is only one of them, which is what exclusively characterizes modern mathematical economics. So in terms of the process of actually reasoning, you see there is a kind of standardization that happens where there is axiomatics. You start with certain axioms, which itself is a product of the formalist movement in mathematics that economics readily subscribe to. So the activity becomes one of proving existence of equilibrium, showing their uniqueness, understanding their stability, and understanding why or whether the equilibrium is optimal. So if you take a typical journal article in economic theory or mathematical economics, you will find that economic problem is often posed as an equilibrium problem, in which you try to find the right axioms and under which you can show the existence of the equilibrium, and you talk about whether this equilibrium is only unique, or if there are multiple equilibria, how can we move from one to the other? And you talk about stability, whether if it is resistant to perturbations, and whether this is optimal in very specific senses, either in the sense of Pareto or other senses that we can talk about. So there is also an increasing sort of affinity that you see from Neumann onwards to fixed point arguments to establish equilibrium. So all of this are often accompanied with what is known as non-constructive proofs. We will see what they are. So I'm just giving you a picture over time what happens to the bread and butter activities of mathematical economics. So this standardization may not in itself be problematic, because standardization sort of cleans up stuff. It is useful. We have seen in many instances, for instance, standardization of rail tracks are certainly useful. But what happens is here, standardization from multiple standard has slowly moved towards near homogenization, and that is a problem. So there's also this schizophrenia between you establish the existence of a certain economic object, like for instance, the general equilibrium, which is a handmaiden for saying that markets are going to be optimal and so on. And so these are essentially established using non-constructive proofs of existence, but their computation is used or is developed from a very different mathematical framework. Why? Because if you show non-constructive proofs, you're essentially not showing way in which you can compute that object. We will come back to that in a second. So I want to start with Debru, who's a Nobel Prize winner, who's also the co-author of Kenneth Arrow, improving the existence of the general equilibrium, known as the Arrow-Debru general equilibrium. So he says that to somebody trained in the uncompromising rigor of Bourbaki, counting equations and unknowns in the Walrasian system could not be satisfactory. The nagging question of existence was posed. Now, I'm setting this up because I want to get to the point of what existence is and how that is completely dictated by a certain kind of Greek understanding of mathematics. So here, the solving equations, which genuinely is a legitimate enterprise, was transformed into proving existence through fixed point arguments. So now he says that a proof of existence is now considered a necessary adjunct of a model proposing a concept of an economic equilibrium. And in a recent survey, more than 350 publications containing existence proof of this type were listed. And this is in the 80s. It only has increased since then. So this proofs or proofs of existence can be seen as methods of persuasion. But these methods of persuasion are often devoid of numerical content, especially in fixed point arguments of the type which are used in economics. And contrast this with the fact that economics is about studying inherently numerical objects of either money or wealth or inequality of different sorts. From that, there is a big shift from what is the kind of way in which we perceive economic problems. Now, my screen is frozen for some reason. I might have to go back and switch it. Sorry about that. So if you look at decolonization, now what is this got to do with decolonization? So if you think about decolonization not as undoing existing colonial influences, but also resisting future ones. So for instance, if we move back by removing certain kinds of theories that are being taught, introducing important voices, is that alone enough? Now, certainly representation of missing, suppressed voices is important, and it is necessary. The question that I'm asking is slightly different. The question is, will this be sufficient? Sufficient to ensure a future homogenization of the kind that we see today? This could be in terms of missing voices in terms of gender, race, but also in terms of theories, in terms of different ways of looking at the economy. Now, the question that interests me is, how do we institute a resistance to this homogenization that is both sustainable and effective? And one possibility that I see is to systematically incorporate diversity in reasoning to challenge this epistemic domination. Now, diversity in reasoning is often, relegated to the realm of only theories, but not into the realm of logic. We seem to willingly embrace the fact that there is only one kind of logic or reasoning that is available. So for instance, it's often that when you challenge fellow mathematical economists saying, but there's only one way of looking at the problem, he said, no, but this is mathematical, it has to be true. It is a very hard argument to make, but I hope that I can at least persuade some of you to think about it here. So all of this boils down to reasoning, persuasion, and proofs in the way, because today we do not challenge the existence of ROW equilibrium. It is done and dusted. Same is true for many of the different theories and theorems. So it's worth remembering what Hardy has to say about proofs. He talks about, there is, strictly speaking, there's no such thing as a mathematical proof. We can, in the last analysis, do nothing but point. Proofs are what Littlewood and I call as gas, rhetorical flourishes designed to affect psychology. Pictures on the board in the lecture, devices to stimulate imagination of pupils. What he's getting at is that this idea of, unquestionable way of proving something as something that is detached from human endeavor is itself challengeable. There is, these are rhetorical devices, which means acts of persuasion. Now, if logic is an act of persuasion, is an act of, trying to find what is good argument vis-a-vis bad argument, there are certain questions immediately that pop up. First of all, we want to remind that there is an exclusive reliance of economic reasoning on classical mathematics and logic. But if logic is an epistemic activity of reasoning, that is, to find out what is a reasonable way of arriving at a solution or a judgment. For both ordinary and formal language, what logic does is it codifies the validity of arguments. What is a valid argument? You can delineate admissible from inadmissible forms of reasoning. This is what often logic is seen to be doing. So, your deductions have to be truth preserving from your axioms. You start with certain premises and you see whether deductions are going to be, preserving the inherent truths which are there in these axioms. So if you look at all these things and put it side by side with what Hardy is saying, logic becomes, a normative object, in the sense that it tells what ought to be correct reasoning. It is not that there is an exclusive non-value judgment aspect that is out there called this book, or Platonic kind of system which is out there. And many logicians actually reject this idea of logic being non-normative. So if logic is a persuasive activity, it's immediate that it is not hard to understand that it will be contingent on history, it will be contingent on culture, it will be contingent on time and space. For instance, if you're a medieval mind, the acts or the kind of ways in which we persuade each other will be determined by the kind of exposure that we have, the kind of education that we have, the kind of acceptability of arguments which are specific to that society. So these are not exclusive in or Platonic in that sense. So all I'm trying to say is that there is an argument to be made that if logic is seen as normative, it has to be contingent on history, time, and space. And that brings us to quite a few interesting questions. So if you look at classical logics, some of the principles, now I'm not listing all the principles, some of the principles that are relevant for our discussion are the law of non-contradiction. That is, a proposition can be both true and false is unacceptable. Why? Because from contradictions you can prove anything. So for the Greeks, this was a big problem in the sense that they really thought this is something that should be avoided at all cost. And there is also the notion of double negation, which is not. That is, double negation of P is seen to be taken as the affirmation of P, which is also something that we do in contrapositives. There is another law which is also important for our discussion, is the law of excluded middle. That is, every proposition has to be either true or false. There is nothing in between. And there is law of identity and so on. But I just want to point out that proof by contradiction, which is reductio ad absurdum, which is to assume a contradiction and then or assume a statement to be true, then show contradiction, and therefore the contrapositive is proved. Now, in this case, you see what underpins this whole methodology is consistency is very important. So this is what also David Hilbert was after. If you show consistency, then that is seen to imply existence of an object. That is, statements which are consistent with an axiomatic system are seen to imply existence of that mathematical object, without actually showing how to actually arrive at this object, how to construct this object, how to algorithmically find this object, and so on. And another notorious axiom that always pops up in economics without much thought is the axiom of choice, which creates all sorts of problems with respect to infinite objects, which of course we use quite routinely. But the dogmatism of classical logic is not just specific to the Greeks or the Western mind, but it's also something that is more pervasive. Look at what Avicenna, the medieval philosopher scientist, has to say. Anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burnt is not the same as not to be burnt. So you see that there is a certain kind of resistance to contradictions that are inherent in a lot of civilizations. Some of the questions that we want to ask here is there only one right kind of mathematics? Is there only one right kind of logic? Is mathematics first the only way to persuade or demonstrations of truth, ways to demonstrate truth concerning economics? And the second question is, what kind of mathematics is appropriate for economics? What is economics a study of? If we're talking about, for instance, a good example is if you're talking about money, money can at best be a rational number, but we always theorize, almost always theorize on using real numbers because it's very convenient. And that's what your classical mathematical training gives you. And we also have to think about what kind of logics are appropriate for economics. We haven't talked about any logic other than the classical logic so far. So are there alternative non-classical logic? There's no surprise here, of course. Yes, there are. The first among them I want to point out is the intuitionistic or constructive logic. So intuitionism is a very important movement in the philosophy of mathematics. In fact, it is by one of the great topologists, Brouwer, who is famous for the Brouwer fixed point theorem, which is used a lot in economics, but they forget that Brouwer himself denounced the theorem as to be intuitionistically invalid. In fact, a generalization of Brouwer's fixed point theorem called Kakutani's fixed point theorem, which is also non-constructive, is what is being used to prove existence of the Nash equilibrium, and also which in turn gets employed in the proof of the general equilibrium by Arrow and Debreu. Now the thing is, this is not constructifiable. So the question you can ask is, okay, it is non-intuitionistic. Can we do something to that theorem in a way, Brouwer's fixed point theorem, in a way that it can be used constructively? But the answer, at least so far, is that it can't be, because it relies on another theorem called the Bolzano-Weierstrass theorem. Now, that's we don't want to get into that kind of technical argument, but here, what we need to know is that intuitionism, as a philosophy of mathematics, rejects all aspects of classical mathematics that go beyond human intuition, which means they reject certain laws that are taken to be granted in classical logic. For instance, the law of excluded middle. That is, something doesn't have to be only true or false, there is something in between. Either it is undecidable, we don't know what it is. There is the excluded middle, that's the third, tertium non datur, is something that is rejected by intuitionistic logic. They also reject uncritical reliance on double negation. For instance, there are other mathematicians or mathematical economists who make very flippant arguments about how, oh, they do not believe in proof by contradiction, or they do not use law of excluded middle. But you have to understand that intuitionistic mathematics only rejects law of excluded middle in infinitary cases. Because to talk about infinite objects and to say that there can be either true or false, it goes beyond human intuition that we can verify or construct. So they do not accept it in faith. So similarly, the process of construction is at the core of demonstrating existence. There are no indirect arguments. If you want to show equilibrium, construct that object. Give me step-by-step procedure by which I can arrive at that object. And this step-by-step procedure is given very precise meaning within computability theory, for example, as an algorithm, which is equivalent to a Turing machine. Or it could be in terms of an intuitive object like construction in the sense of Brouwer. But the idea that is important here is that construction, or the process of showing step-by-step procedure, is very important. So the intuitionistic logic, although I have to be careful here because Brouwer himself thought that logic is a part of a mathematical activity. There is no such thing called intuitionistic logic. People later, especially Hating, got this together and identified those aspects of classical logic that are in conflict with intuitionistic understanding, and he removes that for another time. But what we need to know is that if we relax certain aspects of classical logic, you have other ways of reasoning as well, which are completely legitimate. These are proper wings of mathematics, which we have never been exposed to as economists. Someone might ask, what is the relevance of this to mathematical economics? It can be shown that many important proofs and results in mathematical economics are non-constructive or uncomputable and undecidable. Undecidability is to do with results by Kurt Gödel on there are things that on which we can it is impossible to decide whether a given proposition is either true or false, because there is no step-by-step procedure to do that. Now, for some reason, this keeps back to. Sorry. Now, let's go back to some of the other civilizations, how they have reasoned about this. Is this the only way to reason? Because I told you it is historically contingent and so on. It is important to, this is Mumford, David Mumford, a very eminent mathematician writing on Indian mathematics. It's a review of a book by Kim Tofka, and he says that it is important to recognize two essential differences between the Indian approach and that of the Greeks, because India also has a very strong mathematical tradition. First of all, where Euclid and so on created pure mathematics devoid of any actual numbers, based especially on their invention of the indirect proof by contradiction arguments or reductio ad absurdum arguments. The Indians were primarily applied mathematicians, focusing on finding algorithms, constructions, algorithms for astronomical predictions, and philosophically predisposed to reject indirect arguments. So you see, ways of reasoning that are acceptable and unacceptable differs across civilizations. And these are legitimate mathematical developments which would meet many standards of rigor, because there is no absolute definition of rigor that we can come up with that encompasses all forms of reasoning. And he goes on to say that, in fact, Buddhists and Jains created what is now known as Belknap's four-valued logic. That assertion can be true, false, neither, or both. We will come back to that. This is called Catuskoti. So the Indian mathematicians had a tradition where they're consistently looking for constructive arguments and justifications and numerical algorithms. This is especially true of certain schools of Indian mathematics, especially the Madhava school or the Kerala school. What he says is this way of reasoning simply didn't fit with the Indian way of viewing mathematics. But I'm sure there are other examples with the Chinese and other civilizations which have been quite, which have recorded history of long traditions of mathematics as well. But it is also wrong. I mean, in this case, I have to qualify. The truth is something that is a bit more nuanced. It's not that Indian mathematicians didn't know what proof was. In fact, they use proofs. They are called upapattis or tarkas in Indian mathematics. And you would see a lot of these, being demonstrated to people who are listening, or to fellow mathematicians or kings and so on. But there is a crucial difference. A tarka is used only to prove non-existence of certain entities. So it is never to prove existence. Existence is always proved using algorithms or constructive or directive proofs, which they relied on, because they were deeply suspicious about indirect arguments that went beyond intuition. So now we talked about Belknap's four-valued logic a little bit. I want to meditate a bit more on that before we end the talk. So this is another notion called Catuskoti, which is often referred to as tetralemma. And it is a very important principle in both Buddhist and Hindu logic. You can find examples of this in Madhyamaka. Nagarjuna talks about it. It refers to what is known as four corners. That is, 4 different possibilities in which we can answer about any proposition or question. It can be that a proposition can be true, false, both true and false, neither true nor false. Because here there is a genuine acknowledgement of the fact that you do not have the means to decide. That there is this whole thing about we have to know and we will know, and maths gives all answers to that, is a bit of a deceptive path. So here a statement can be both true, false, true, false, both true and false, neither true nor false. This is also known as relevance logic. So we already have seen 3-valued logic, that is the intuitionistic logic in some sense, Belknap's 4-valued logic. And there is also other kinds of logic where we dispense with laws of contradiction. Because earlier, remember, I said law of contradiction, or law of non-contradictions rather, is detested by classical mathematicians, because from contradiction, everything follows. That you show contradiction from which, if you have a disjunction, you can pretty much derive anything that you want. So it's a dangerous enterprise and so on. But paraconsistent logic actually says that contradictions do not necessarily explode. It's called the principle of explosion. Contradictions do not necessarily explode into triviality. It does not make the mathematical enterprise trivial if there are contradictions. When information is contradictory, it is not a disaster as they make it out to be. So this inconsistency is accommodated in a very controlled way in paraconsistent logic. So contradictions are seen as potentially informative. Elsewhere in a paper, I've argued that, in fact, impossibilities, disjunctions are creative enterprises, and that paradoxes, puzzles are very legitimate ways of theorizing. So here, disjunctions does not mean dysfunction. That's important to remember. And even within paraconsistency, there are a group of people known as dialetheists, of which Graham Priest is a leading advocate. They hold true that real contradictions do exist in reality, and the job of logic is to articulate that way of reasoning, and what do we do about it? So for instance, when people hold contradictory, incompatible, or incommensurable viewpoints, which is often the case in economics, for any problem that in my opinion is interesting, if there are different value judgments and so on, you will end up with incommensurable views, incommensurable arguments, contradictory arguments. The question is, how do we deal with them? Now, for instance, I do not know of any work in economics that actually tries to bridge this gap and to allow for these kind of things. So this is paraconsistent logic. Now I go back to a dialogue between Buddha and his disciple in Majjhima Nikaya. So he is asking, Buddha is being questioned by one of the disciples. And the idea is to show how even Katuskoti is not enough. How is it, Gautama? Does Gautama believe that the saint exists after death, and that this view alone is true and everything else is false? Buddha says, no, Vaka, I do not hold that the saint exists after death, and this alone is the only view and everything else is false. Then he goes on to ask, does Gautama then believe that the saint does not exist after death, and that this view alone is true and everything else is false? He says, no, Vaka, I do not hold that this to be the case. And then he goes on to ask, does the saint both exist and does not exist after death? He says no. And similarly for neither exists nor does not exist. So here you see a case where the 4 options, supposedly exhaustive options, are all denied by Buddha. Now, what does it mean? One interpretation, certainly there are other interpretations, one interpretation is to think that this exhaustive logic may be useful for some instances, but when it comes to the question of salvation or other questions that are of interest to the Buddhist metaphysics, this is not relevant. So there is not just a missing third as in intuitionistic logic, there is a missing fifth. So that you have to sort of think of this as that there is logic and there is the notion of relevance. So in other words, you need horses suited for the courses. The choice of logic should depend on the question, the actors involved, and other consideration that might be important. And this is quite relevant for economics. The solution is not, I'm not suggesting that you have to replace classical logic with intuitionistic logic or paraconsistent logic. In fact, that is just recolonization, not decolonization. Instead, plurality of the logic is what I think is the need for the day, both in teaching and in research. Different rhetorics, different ways of reasoning, and try to sort of, sharpen our understanding of where our value differences are, and so on. So if we manage to teach our students pluralism in its deep sense, not just pluralism of theories, teaching heterodox economics and mainstream economics, but also encouraging them to think about different ways of reasoning, I think an appreciation for different yet valid forms of reasoning may be cultivated systematically. And this, I think, ties up with this notion of Pyrrhonian skepticism. What is a Pyrrhonian skepticism? A skeptic is not someone who is dogmatic that something is not possible. In fact, it is the Greek origins of the word really means to search. So a continued inquiry, a suspension of judgment, not dogma. And I think this little too much surety with the mathematical methods is a bit of a problem, I think, in mathematical economics. I'm not saying it doesn't have its use, but I think there is a healthy level of skepticism that we need to cultivate among students in terms of reasoning, and also amongst researchers. And skepticism is not necessarily a bad thing. It's in fact a good thing. So if we manage to do so, it is at least my hope that a pluralism of voices, ideas, and theories, which I think is the spirit of decolonization in my view, could be a consequence from this approach. And I'll stop there. I think I've taken too much time. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Raghu. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thanks a lot. I'm going to stop the recording now.